Keavy navigated her skateboard down the slight descent in the uneven concrete sidewalk, unbothered by the flickering of the dying streetlights and the faint mist of rain that had started to fall. Rolling directly through an intersection without hesitating, the flashing yellow glow of the traffic light above her head issuing a useless warning of caution to non-existent motorists, she tossed her long dreadlocks back under her hood as best she could so as not to get them wet. She had never travelled this far down this particular cul-de-sac. She'd hoped she'd never have to, but her deadbeat father had returned home half drowned in booze again, blowing all of his paycheck on card games and discount whiskey. The only way her younger brother and herself were going to have money for groceries that week was if she continued to scavenge some new merchandise from the abandoned houses a few streets away. It started out simple enough. She'd stolen a few tools and sports equipment out of open garages during the early evening when the families were still awake and oblivious to the concept that someone would be daring enough to steal from them knowing they were home. She avoided breaking into cars, too risky, even the dingy-looking ones, and she always steered clear of houses with dogs, despite how large they were. Any amount of suspicious barking was too much. Soon, she'd poached and pawned everything worth taking on her street, and the streets on either side of it. But unfortunately, what had once been only a temporary option had turned into an acceptable solution when her father refused to kick his infuriating and selfish habit of wasting his week's pay on one night of pleasure, instead of using it to feed his kids. Luckily, she proved to be naturally gifted at petty theft, and it seemed the farther away she travelled from her street, the more confident she became. She started leaving her house later at night, upgrading her targets to unoccupied garden sheds, pool houses, and once even a walk-in basement. Never once had she been caught, and there had only ever been 2 occurrences when she had been forced to make a quick getaway. She only ever stole things that weren't worth the victim's time calling the police over, such as extension cords and bike locks. She'd once passed up the opportunity to take a Rolex watch someone had carelessly left outside by their pool because she feared the possibility of the cops checking local pawn shops for it. Soon to become the victim of her own success, after a few short months, she'd picked over all of the neighborhood side streets within a reasonable distance on her skateboard, and she didn't like the idea of revisiting the same targets. The final cul-de-sac left to harvest hardly seemed likely to yield a fertile crop. Most of the houses were crumbling wrecks, with boarded-up windows and overgrown yards. What few tenants did live there were mostly either squatters or people even worse off than herself. Over the past few trips down this dying street, she'd found a handful of decent enough lawn ornaments, a faded Yankees flag, an older model stereo, and a relatively new set of leather boots left out on a front porch. Tonight, much to her chagrin, she was going to have to venture further down the street to see what she could find, where the houses became creepier and the shadows became darker. As she reached the last house, she stepped off her skateboard and picked it up silently, scanning the house and yard, and careful to remain on the sidewalk for a moment so as not to look like she was intending to trespass. The house was so dilapidated, the front porch had actually collapsed forward, detaching itself from the framework of the structure. The front door was boarded shut, its rusty hinges looking ready to crumble into dust, and grass sprouted upwards through the cracks in the driveway. Keavy cursed under her breath. This was going to be a complete waste of time. Anything left abandoned in this place wouldn't be worth the price of a vitamin water. Deciding to commit to the lost cause, she stepped forward onto the lawn and approached the house carefully, her skateboard in one hand and her switchblade in the other. She always carried a knife on her, strictly for protection and not for threatening anyone. She took great pride in the fact that none of her thefts had ever once resulted in anyone getting hurt. There was no way she was going to climb over the wreckage of rotted lumber that had once been the front porch, so instead she walked around the perimeter of the house to make absolutely sure she didn't spot a light on inside anywhere, and managed to coax the back door open with a little bit of pressure on the knob. Once inside, she leaned her skateboard against the wall and flicked on her penlight, pointing it directly at the ground so as to make sure she didn't kick or trip over anything. The house smelled musty and wet, and she had a sick feeling that rats were probably infesting the walls around her. The kitchen appeared to have been raided long ago, all of its cabinets hanging open, and appliances either destroyed or taken. The living room only contained an ancient sagging sofa and the wooden skeleton of an old recliner. She carefully cracked open doors as she passed, mindful of clutter that could possibly topple out on top of her if disturbed. When she discovered the basement stairs, she immediately knew she didn't want to venture down them for any reason. The air below felt cold, and cobwebs ran across the stairway in every direction. The darkness at the bottom of the warped wooden steps reminded her of a black hole, waiting to swallow anything that wandered too close. The stairs leading upwards to the second floor didn't appear much better. The bottom 2 steps at ground level were actually missing, and she noticed a withered mouse carcass on the 5th step up. The final room she inspected was the den, which was, without question, the most well-furnished section of the house she'd discovered so far. In addition to a desk and 2 chairs, there was a bookshelf lined with hardcover books on every shelf against the far wall. She decided to check the desk drawers for any valuables first, and then she'd give the bookshelf a try. If she couldn't find anything hidden amongst them, the books themselves may be worth something if they're in good condition. As she made her way around the desk, her heart skipped a beat and her blood ran cold. She froze in her tracks and remained perfectly still, not even daring to breathe for a full 10 seconds. The beam of her penlight illuminated something resting on the seat of the chair behind the desk that had no logical reason to be in that house. It was a camcorder, a brand new one, without a scratch or speck of dust upon it. That didn't make sense. Who would have entered this house recently enough to bring a camcorder as expensive as that just to leave it behind? Was there someone in the house with her? Had she interrupted some kind of sicko recording the people in the neighboring houses? Or had some young thrill-seekers come on a ghost hunting expedition and become scared and fled, leaving their camera behind in their panic? Whatever the explanation, Keavy didn't appreciate the position she suddenly found herself in. Granted, the camera would easily earn her more cash than every other thing on this street combined had, but she hadn't made it this far down the side streets by being careless and simply grabbing the shiniest thing in the room. She had to be mindful of potential traps or surprises. Keavy took 3 steps back and positioned herself behind the door before turning her penlight off and casting herself into complete darkness. She made herself slowly count to 100 inside her head, ears straining to identify any sound within the house that could be an indication that someone was waiting to ambush her or returning to collect their camcorder. When she reached 100, she decided to count to 200, just to be safe. And when she still didn't hear anything suspicious, she flicked her light back on and walked over to the camera. Whatever the situation was, she seemed to be safe enough for the time being. Setting her knife down on the desk and carefully placing the penlight between her teeth, she picked up the camera cautiously as if it were made of glass. Sitting herself down in the chair, she switched on the camera and flipped open the screen to discover with astonishment that the battery was about 2/3 full. She glanced around the room again, as if making sure she was still alone. The smart thing to do would have been to leave the house immediately with her newfound treasure, but somehow she still didn't trust the device. She didn't want to return home with it just yet, until she'd learned more about its origins. She shut off her penlight. With the camcorder screen on, there was more than enough light in the room. Too much light, in fact. Enough where she could easily be spotted from outside through the window in the off chance of a patrolling cop car happening to drive by. She decided to move the chair and crawl under the desk, folding her legs upwards so she could rest the camera on her knees. She adjusted the volume to just above a whisper and began to watch the playback. Keavy expected to immediately see the picture dancing around uncomfortably as whoever was using the camera walked through the house with it in his hand. But instead, there was a clear, steady shot of a middle-aged man looking directly into the camera, daylight streaming inside the window next to him, seated at the very desk she crouched beneath. The man looked at the camera silently for a few seconds, his eyes nervous and tired, as he seemed to try to summon the words he felt were important enough to keep a record of. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and finally, in a forlorn yet firm voice, he began to speak.
My name is Dr. Anthony Hudson, a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. I'm documenting this in case I'm never heard from again, so at least some kind of account exists as to why I chose to take the following actions. I'm recording this in my former childhood home, which appears to have been vacant for a considerable time and has fallen into a state of severe disrepair. Had I known that I likely would have not made the effort to return, because it seems unlikely this message will be found anywhere in the near future. However, I'm tired of running, and the state of my surroundings seems morbidly appropriate given what I have to recount. I've never been a spiritual man. The only worshipping I've ever done was to the unshakable truths science provides, and my devotion has always been to the pursuit of facts and hard evidence. I find myself unable to provide any facts or evidence regarding what I am about to explain, and that troubles me deeply, because it leads me to believe our science is flawed. It always has been, and it likely always will be. It goes against everything I've always stood for by saying this, but there are some things in this world that are simply unexplainable. For the sake of simplicity, I'll begin with the incident in my childhood and proceed from there. In the early 80s, I lived in this house as a child. There were far less houses on this street then. In fact, I believe ours may have been the first one constructed. There were far more trees surrounding our yard, and myself and my older sister would often play outside. As a child, I would have horrific nightmares, which by itself isn't uncommon. But while other children likely had nightmares about more common things, such as monsters under the bed, my dreams were alarmingly specific and appallingly detailed. Try to imagine a traditional centaur, a fictional half-man and half-horse creature. Now imagine it entirely black in color, as if bathed in tar, with enormous, jagged antlers large enough to impale an average-sized man. Its eyes were always a pale, cold, sickly blue, devoid of any emotion except possibly calculated hatred. Its face was never human. It was always more animal, and not exactly like a deer's head, but closer to that than anything else. I imagine if deers were carnivores instead, their faces may resemble it. More, I don't know how to describe it. Reptilian, I suppose. But the worst, what made it more than unsettling, more than frightening, more demonic, may be the right word, were its hands. Upon its palms were additional mouths, complete with fangs, so it could consume a victim without having to raise them to its face. Simply by grabbing hold of it would result in flesh being feasted upon. This creature, what I used to refer to as the deer monster in my youth, which became the black stag as I grew older, was what would visit me in my dreams at least once a week from age 6 onward. In the dream, it would always emerge from the trees behind my house, normally around sunset, its arrival anticipated like the moon and stars. It would stomp angrily around the house, sounding more terrifying than any thunderstorm in its fury, before finding someone outside the house, a neighbor, I suppose, to drag back into the woods, screaming. Where sounds of torture and mutilation would always follow. These dreams would traumatize me, especially when the black stag would occasionally abduct someone I recognized in reality. Our mailman, our babysitter, even my grandparents. As a child, I could never be persuaded to play outside as the sun set, even when we weren't at home. Doctors and child psychologists at the time couldn't identify the source of the dreams, but they all agreed that in time they would pass. By the time I was 12, I told my parents the dreams had stopped. But I lied. They never did. My older sister disappeared somewhere in those trees when I was 14. She went back there to climb a tree as the sun was going down and never came back. That night I dreamt of her being taken by the stag, raped, tortured, and eaten alive. And she called my name as it happened. The police concluded she had been abducted. After another year, my parents could no longer stand the morbid shadows being cast by those trees upon our property. They divorced, and we moved away. Now we come to the more recent events. I understand the implication of what I'm about to say. I don't expect anyone to believe me, as I have no tangible evidence. All I have to offer is the word of 4 separate doctors in the field of mental health that I'm not clinically insane, and 2 different MRI scans proving there is no recognizable defect of any kind regarding my brain. The Black Stag was never just a dream. It is real. I have physically seen it while awake and uninhibited by drugs or alcohol. The dreams continued into my adult years, still always taking place at my childhood home, with myself always residing inside my bedroom. I got used to them, and learned how to go about my life without showing how much they were affecting me. It made relationships hard, as I would often awaken suddenly at night, crying out in fear, ravaged by cold sweat. I never found a way to explain those outbursts to my girlfriend in a way she could understand, or at least tolerate. She eventually left me after 3 years, worried, and I suppose rightly so, about my state of mind. I may have married her one day, if not for the dreams. If you're watching this, Laura, I never stopped loving you, and thank you for putting up with me for as long as you did. I'm sorry I could never tell you this while we were together. The first time I saw the stag while awake, I was 21 years old. I was at a beach party in Florida with several other college students. It was the middle of the night, and we were sitting around a bonfire. I'd been drinking earlier in the day, but had stopped a few hours before, as I was required to drive a few people home. I wasn't the only one who saw it, as it looked down upon us from the bluff. Someone pointed out that we were being watched, and we all looked up to see its outline against the moon. Some speculated it was a guy on a horse, others that it was a freakishly large buck, while I just sat there, having a panic attack. The stag eventually vanished, and the next day, barely any of them recalled the sighting. When I was 25, I saw it again at dawn while leaving my girlfriend's apartment. I had dreamed about it the night before and saw it across the street among the trees, holding what appeared to be an animal carcass, likely a dog. My girlfriend was the one who actually pointed it out to me. Having come to the door to kiss me goodbye, she asked me what I thought it was, and I rushed us back inside and locked the door. She went to find a camera, but again the stag vanished before she could photograph it. There were several more instances throughout my life when it showed itself, but the last one I'll mention was when I was 40 years old. The stag cornered me in a parking garage in the middle of the night. Most of the lights were out, and I was alone, navigating myself towards my car using my cell phone as a flashlight. I spotted its pale eyes across the lot as it came galloping towards me, its thundering hooves echoing against the concrete walls. I escaped up the stairs, but it crashed into a car with enough force to obliterate the frame and knock it sideways out of its parking spot. There was one witness who heard the thundering noise and came running to witness the crash. He was an elderly retired policeman who told detectives in his statement he had witnessed the car struck by some buffalo-looking thing, and did not give a statement. There were no working security cameras, and it was eventually ruled as a hit and run. I saw that elderly man taken by the Black Stag in my dream that night. I've attempted to research this creature for years, and I can't find any record of it in theology, mythology, or historical accounts. The only consistency I can determine seems to be that even though it only appears in my vicinity, others can see it. I don't know what it wants from me, if anything other than to terrorize me. But after the parking garage incidents, I could no longer simply accept it as a harmless phenomenon. Earlier this month, I contacted a woman named Deborah Barish, who advertised herself as a spiritual medium. I didn't come to this decision lightly, but as every avenue of science and traditional methods of research have failed me, I needed to open my mind to a possible supernatural solution. To her credit, she was very courteous and professional, not some kind of crystal ball gazing hack fortune teller you find at carnivals. She listened to my history with the creature very carefully and asked several questions regarding my family lineage and my religious upbringing. Her conclusion was that the stag was targeting me as a result of some kind of demon-worshipping ritual my great-uncle, who I regret to say was a clansman, likely participated in. Without accepting any money from me, she attempted to leave, stating the black stag was a being beyond her abilities to confront. She persuaded me to have my home blessed and to wear a cross, and it may keep the creature at bay for a time. But she warned me it was likely never something I could fully escape from. I'm not too proud to say I broke down and cried, begging her not to leave, but to help me in whatever way she could. At the very least, help me be able to sleep without it intruding upon my dreams. Unfortunately for her, she decided to stay. We performed what is called a séance, and she tried to communicate with the stag, trying to discover its name and why it had chosen to torment me. We knew it was coming when the floor started to shake. It appeared behind her, within the house as if birthed from the shadows. She told me to ignore it, to only focus on her words, but I panicked and let go of her hands. The stag impaled her with its antlers and lifted her into the air, blood raining down upon it like a storm. It raised its hands and feasted upon her while she was still alive, tearing her apart with the fangs within its palms. I ran from the house, too mortified to attempt to help her in any way.
At this point in the recording, Dr. Hudson removed his glasses and wiped the start of terrified and humiliated tears from his eyes. Keavy clung to the camera, wide-eyed with shaking hands, as the man pulled a revolver out of a drawer by his side. He took several deep breaths and continued.
To Deborah's family, I'd like to express my most sincere apologies and deepest condolences. I have no family of my own, and just this morning finalized the redrafting of my last will and testament, leaving all that I own to her children to either be accepted or donated to a charity of their choosing. I can no longer live like this, with the knowledge that the stag will always be living in my shadow. I've decided to confront it. I'm not sure if I can hurt it in any significant way, but I do know that it does, or at least can, exist in a physical state. If I can't stop it, hopefully I can at least go out on my own terms before it kills me the way it has killed so many others. I'm going to shut off the camera and leave it here in this room. If you found me, that means I've failed and am almost certainly dead. If any good can come of this experience, it is this warning. Let this be my legacy. We believe ourselves as humans to be the most intelligent, capable, and powerful beings to exist on this planet, if not all of creation. We believe that we have all the answers, or at least we will have them one day. I tell you now, we know nothing. We haven't even scratched the surface of the mysteries of the universe, and we never will. Because there are certain things science will never be able to answer. And for people like myself, such a concept is, or at least was, completely inconceivable.
Dr. Hudson reached out and picked up the camera.
One final piece of advice. I don't know if once I'm dead, the Black Stag will still haunt these grounds. But if you're still in the house, I recommend you leave. Immediately.
The screen went dark. Keavy sat in terrified silence for several seconds, too frightened to move. This had to be a prank, some morbid reality TV show or internet stunt. But despite her brain trying to reassure her, she was the victim of some kind of elaborate hoax. The cold chill in her gut told her otherwise. How could anyone have possibly anticipated someone randomly wandering into this house and finding the camcorder? She slapped herself in the forehead. It didn't matter. She was going to wipe her fingerprints off the camera and leave it where she'd found it. She didn't want anything more to do with it. Crawling out from under the desk, she climbed to her feet on shaky legs. Flicking on her pen light, she placed the camera back on the chair and wiped it clean with her shirt. As she turned to exit the room, she glanced at the desk, looking for her switchblade. It wasn't there. That couldn't be. She specifically remembered setting it down there when she went to pick up the camera. She used her penlight to search around the floor, and even though she knew it was pointless, she dug frantically through her pockets. The knife was gone. Keavy felt the beginning of genuine panic setting in. Someone had entered the room while she watched the video beneath the desk and had taken the knife, leaving her defenseless. The sound of her heartbeat pounded like cannon fire within her head. Could someone really have entered so quietly? She hadn't even heard a whisper of movement from under the desk. What did she do now? Run? Hide? Should she slam the door to the den and barricade herself in, waiting for daybreak? No. She didn't like the notion of being trapped within the house. She didn't have a phone on her. She didn't carry anything that could identify who she was when she went out at night, in case she was caught or mugged. Shit. Had she told her brother where she was going? If she went missing, would they even know where to look? For half a moment, she considered climbing out of the window onto the dilapidated, crumbling porch, but decided against it. She needed to get her skateboard back. That would get her out of here quicker than running. Taking a deep breath, she moved at a brisk walk out of the den and back into the hallway, keeping her eyes focused on the direction she was walking and nowhere else. She turned the corner into the kitchen and breathed a sigh of relief when she saw her skateboard leaning against the wall where she'd left it. She grabbed it and turned the knob on the back door. It wouldn't budge an inch. Frantically, she wrenched at the knob, trying to awkwardly apply pressure the way she had before, no longer worried about leaving fingerprints. It was useless. The knob wasn't yielding. In frustration and despair, Keavy slammed her back against the door and sank into a crouch. Well, she could try the front door, but she had a sinking feeling she wouldn't be able to break through with it boarded shut from the outside. Time to find a window to shimmy out of. She raised herself to her feet, and she was about to head towards the living room when she heard it from the basement beneath her. The sharp thud of something hard against concrete. There came another thud a moment later, followed by two more. It was a series of thuds, not like footsteps, more like the trotting of hooves.
Fuck!
Keavy sprinted across the house into the living room. No longer worried about stealth, she smashed the window out with her skateboard. Hurling the skateboard out into the yard, she began to climb out after it, cutting her hands and arms on the loose shards of glass as she desperately tried to claw her way free. When she was halfway out, she paused as she heard a thundering of hooves, not coming from within the house, but from outside. From around the side of the house galloped the Black Stag, towering at about 7 feet tall, including the antlers, the width of which seemed to span at least 5 feet on their own. Against the moonlight, Keavy saw its pale blue eyes spot her, and it turned and charged forward directly at her. She flung herself back into the house, cutting herself even worse in the process, and ran towards the den. She grabbed the camcorder and bolted towards the steps that led upstairs, crushing the mouse carcass under her boot as she took the steps 3 at a time. When she reached the second floor, she threw herself into the nearest bedroom and slammed the door behind her. She groped through her pockets until she found her pen light and snapped it on, and immediately gasped. The room had dry blood covering the floor and what remained of the tattered mattress. Her foot struck something heavy and metal, and she looked down to discover the revolver she'd seen Dr. Hudson with in the video. As she bent down to grab it, she heard the hoofbeats charging around the outside of the house again. She had to record this thing. If she ever escaped here alive, she was going to need proof of it. And if she couldn't get out of here, well, the world still needed to see it. Turning the camcorder back on, she pressed record and tried to get a decent shot outside the house. But it was too dark to make out anything but shadows and blurs. She turned the camera to face herself, the pen light illuminating her face.
To whoever finds this, my name is Keavy Carver. My father's name is Jonathan Carver and my brother is Daniel Carver. If you've watched this recording from the beginning, you heard all of what Dr. Hudson said. The black stag is real. I found the camera, and now it's trapped me inside the house.
There came a loud crashing from the ground floor, and Keavy nearly dropped the camera. The creature had somehow found a way inside again, and was now somewhere beneath her. Raising the gun in her hand, she looked back at the camera, the beginnings of angry tears forming in her eyes.
Danny, I'm sorry I'm not coming home. I love you so much. Keep growing big and strong, okay, buddy? You'll be...
From the floor beneath her, a massive hand exploded upwards through the ancient wood and grabbed her leg. Keavy dropped the camera and pen light, and, more out of reflex than anything else, cocked the gun and aimed it downwards through the hole in the floor. She pulled the trigger. But when the hammer fell, a dull metallic click was all it produced. The gun was empty. Keavy felt a wave of overwhelming pain shoot up her right side as the hand released her, revealing a massive chunk of flesh bitten away from her thigh, her fresh blood cascading across the ground to cover up the stain of Hudson's dried blood. She collapsed on her back, her dreadlocks spilling free out of her hood and soaking up the blood upon the ground. From directly beneath her, she heard the pounding of the massive hooves as the creature prepared to strike again. Keavy stared up at the ceiling, and through the pain and tears, she laughed out loud.
Go fuck yourself with those toothy hands, you pansy reindeer bitch!
The antlers burst upwards through the floor and impaled Keavy in 8 places, dragging her back down the way a shark snatches its prey. The camera fell through the hole after her, the blood staining the lens as it struck the ground and shattered, before being crushed to dust beneath a massive black hoop.